I sometimes forget to announce myself. My name is Cecilia Espinoza, and this is my last meeting as your chair of the Committee of 100. I also want to take this opportunity tonight to thank the Arlington Independent Media. As you know, we tape this program and it is rebroadcast on the cable channels because of the efforts of Arlington Independent Media. You may or may not also know that Arlington is currently undergoing a review of its franchise agreements with regard to media. And for further information, as in the Arlington Committee of 100 tradition, there's information about that process and about the Arlington Way forums, which are happening with regard to that refranchising agreement that's going on right now. There are several forums where people in the community are being asked to attend and provide input on how you use those cable service, those local program channel cable services and what they mean to us in Arlington County. So please consider going to the Arlington Independent Media's website. It will direct you to the forums and to more information. That's at www.arlingtonmedia.org. www.arlingtonmedia.org. From that website, you can then link into more information about this franchising process. But we really want to take time to thank our volunteers. Tonight they brought in a special crew of volunteers because the regular people couldn't be with us, and we thank them for taking time out of their evening to be with us tonight. As we discussed at the beginning of the evening, tonight we have a wonderful program. It's a program that happens about once a decade because once a decade the state of Virginia goes through a redistricting process. I was just talking to our first speaker, Delegate Bob Brink, this is his 14th year representing Arlington in the state legislature. We are very fortunate to have Delegate Brink with us this evening. As our first speaker, he's going to provide us with the view that he got or had, the unique perspective, being a delegate and seeing how this process actually worked out. He's also going to show us the map and some of its impact on Arlington in particular. Redistricting is important to all of us, and it's important because whatever our representative voice is in the state legislature is determined by how these precincts are drawn. And it is in Richmond that our delegates go and fight to ensure that we have fairness, that voices are heard, and that people's rights are not diluted simply because they are in certain kinds of precincts. I think it's interesting as you look at the redistricting or the districting maps across the country, and I know I've done this recently, and if you really go to the granular level, the local level that we're talking about, many of those districts are purple and not pure red or blue. In some ways, that's what democracy should be. But in some places, we do have areas where things are driven by pure red or pure blue. And our speakers tonight give us an insight into this process, how it's working in our state, and what the new changes mean for us here in Arlington. So with that, I turn it over to our first speaker, Delegate Bob Brink.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank all of you for coming out on this very warm evening to hear about a topic that some people might think is a little dry, but which has a very, very important effect on how we're governed for the next 10 years. Before we begin, as Cecilia mentioned, I've been down in Richmond for 14 years now, and throughout that time I've been heavily involved in issues involving, related to the electoral process, campaign finance, election laws, and so on. And I can tell you that, at the State Board of Elections, among other electoral bodies, Arlington is really the envy of the Commonwealth for the fair and efficient way that our elections are administered. And this is due largely to a tremendous nonpartisan electoral board and a great registrar. So what I'd like to do is to have us give a hand to Charlene Bickford, Alan Harrison, and Linda Lindbergh. It works. It works. What you have up here is a map that, with due regard and graciousness to George Allen, I call the real Virginia. What you see here, the upper map is Virginia geographically, and the lower map is Virginia with every jurisdiction represented by the size of its population. The red and the blue, by the way, are the electoral results for the 2005 governor's election, or as we Democrats call it, happier days. I really think that this is an important map, though, because what it does is it lays out something that is very important demographically. Where the population of this state is in that crescent that starts up in that top obscene bulge, goes down through Richmond and all the way down to Hampton Roads, to Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, and Norfolk. This is where the population is centered in Virginia, and there actually is very little west of Charlottesville. And this plays an important role in the redistricting process, as I'll get to in a second. In Virginia, the redistricting process is driven by three imperatives. First of all, the Supreme Court's one-man, one-vote decision, which means that every legislative district must contain roughly the same number of people after redistricting. Second, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which imposes anti-discrimination requirements on covered jurisdictions, including Virginia. And the third imperative in Virginia is politics. The 2010 census showed that Virginia's population had increased from 7.1 million approximately in 2001 to almost exactly 8 million people. 8,010,000 people. And for those of us who were mathematically challenged, this was a godsend because we could divide things evenly. Now, for instance, with 8 million people and 100 delegate districts, you didn't think there'd be math on this test, but this meant that the ideal district would have just over 80,000 people. And the census confirmed two demographic trends that we knew were going on. One of them, and the major one, was the huge shift in population out of South Side and Southwest Virginia and up to Northern Virginia, particularly the exurbs of Loudoun County, Prince William County, Stafford County, and so on. And so the map, the election map for the House of Delegates, it lays out the districts, and it starts at that far western tip of Virginia, which actually is further west than Detroit, and moves across there. So the districts out there, the delegate districts, are low numbered. And this gives you an idea when I talk about District 1, 2, and 3, what's happened to the population out there. District 1 was almost 10% underpopulated, under that 80,000 ideal figure. District 2 was 13.7% underpopulated, and District 3 was 17.2% underpopulated. At the other end of the state, as we refer to it up here, District 13 out in western Prince William County was 138% overpopulated. Bob Marshall, who's the delegate from that district, was basically sitting on 2.5 delegate districts. Districts 32 and 33, which are out in Loudoun County, were both 40% overpopulated. And so what this meant was there was a huge shift in population from Southside, Southwest, up to Northern Virginia, which had to be reflected in where the district lines were drawn. The second factor that comes in is the Voting Rights Act. A central principle of the Voting Rights Act is something called no retrogression. And essentially what this means is that the map that you produce has to have the same number of majority-minority districts as the old map. So the 2001 delegate map had 12 majority-minority districts, and so the new map had to have at least 12 majority-minority districts. But The second major demographic trend of the past 10 years has been a loss of population in inner city majority-minority districts. Of the 12 such districts, all but one were underpopulated, which means that they fell under that magic 80,000 number by as much as 15%. So these demographic trends played out in shifts in district from the underpopulated areas to the high growth areas. The second district, way out there in coal country, was shifted up to a new second district in Stafford and Prince William County. The 10th district was moved from down there in the North Carolina border in Martinsville and Henry County. The new 10th starts in Loudoun County, goes out to Clark County, ends up pretty close to Front Royal. And the 87th district, which was in downtown Norfolk, now is located in Loudoun County, out near Dulles Airport. In all of these cases, those districts were cannibalized, and their population was shifted and split up among adjoining districts to get them up to the 80,000 figure. And in the case of the 87th district, the one down in Norfolk, the population was split up among adjoining majority-minority districts to repopulate them to comply with the Voting Rights Act. Now, this is where politics comes in. It's not a coincidence that all three of those cannibalized districts were formerly held by Democrats, and that the Republicans held the redistricting pen in the House. And in the case of the 10th district, the one that was down in Martinsville, Henry County, that just happened to be represented by the incumbent who was the House Democratic leader. So politics has a part to play in this process. There's no getting around it as long as we have partisan redistricting. Now, you remember I said there are three factors that guide redistricting in Virginia. One man, one vote, the Voting Rights Act, and politics. In Virginia, up here in Arlington, we didn't have those dramatic swings in population that you've seen in other parts of the state, and so one man, one vote didn't really come into play. We're stable in our population numbers. And we're not subject to the Voting Rights Act, and so that didn't come into play. Politics is another matter. But essentially, the districts that we have now reflect where they were 10 years ago. The 31st Senate District is still based in North Arlington and Central Arlington, although now it stretches up the river all the way to Loudoun County. The 30th District is still based in Alexandria and comes into Arlington south of Columbia Pike. The 32nd District now comes back down into Arlington as it did up until 10 years ago. And so that's nothing new. It's just a reversion to the way things were before 2001. On the House side, the 45th District has a couple of precincts down on the southern border of Arlington. The 49th has most of Arlington south of Columbia Pike. The 47th District, which is held so ably by my friend Patrick Hope, is a central Arlington district and is entirely within Arlington. The one that has had the most dramatic shift actually is the 48th District, which I'm so proud to represent. The 48th District, which had been entirely within Arlington, now has shifted and has added a portion of Fairfax County from the Arlington County line all the way through downtown McLean, all the way to the Beltway. So what this means is, because you have Tyson's Corner at one end and Pentagon City at the other end, like Sarah Palin, I can see 2 Ritz-Carltons from my district. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn this over to Linda Lindberg, who will drill down on what the impacts are specifically on Arlington, and then I look forward to any questions at the end of the time. Thank you.
As Bob indicated, our second speaker is Linda Lindberg, who's been our registrar in Arlington for many years. Linda is an excellent speaker and very knowledgeable. She's ably, as Bob also pointed out, run our elections here in Arlington for many years. In a fair, efficient manner, she serves over the Arlington electoral process, and we're very happy to have her today to tell us about how this is going to impact us here in Arlington. Linda.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you, Delegate Brink, for that segue into my portion of the presentation. He told you what the districts look like. I'm going to show you what the changes look like here in Arlington County. First of all, what changed? As Delegate Brink says, we still have our 4 House districts in Arlington County, and we have added a portion of the 32nd Senate district. 3 of our precincts, however, were split between districts, and I'll come back to that in a moment and what the aspects, what that means to us. This is a map. This is actually from the Virginia Public Access Project that shows both the old and new districts. Here we're starting with the 45th House District. The pink is the new, no, the other way around. The pink is the old district and the blue is the new district. The purple in the middle was the overlap between the two. So you see Arlington is way up here in that very top portion. We just had a little bit of Arlington County to begin with in the 45th district. We gained 1 more precinct and a portion of another. So the breakdown is 73% in Alexandria, 19% in Arlington, and Fairfax County 8%. And this is what it looks like in terms of our precincts here in Arlington. You can see it more graphically on an Arlington-specific map. 45th House District, as Delegate Brink said, it's still entirely within Arlington. It just did a little bit of a shift from South Arlington up to part of North Arlington, 100% Arlington County. And this is what it looks like, the specific precinct. So if you know your precinct number, everybody knows their precinct number, right? If you know your precinct number, you can find it on this map, and you know who represents you. 45th House District, Delegate Brink's district, as he says, now the blue goes way up to McLean. And he did lose a couple of precincts, actually the ones that he lost to the 47th District in Arlington County. It's still 69% Arlington, no longer 100% Arlington, Fairfax County 31%. And this is what it looks like in terms of the map of Arlington County. It just sort of follows right there along the Potomac River. 49th House District hasn't really had too much of a change within Arlington County. It's just some minor changes in the south part of the county. And it's 77% Arlington, 23% Fairfax County. What's significant here is it used to include part of Alexandria. Now it's a primarily Arlington district, so it's really a lot stronger for us here in Arlington County. Here's what it looks like on the map. And now moving to the Senate districts. 30th Senate District, the blue is the new. So that Senate District now is stretching all the way down to the Mount Vernon, Mason, almost down to Mason Neck in Fairfax County. In Arlington County, not significant changes, just a few precincts. We're the smallest portion of this district, 41% Alexandria, 31% Fairfax, 28% Arlington County. And blue is the 30th Senate District here, Arlington County. So it's most of the southern portion of Arlington County. 31st Senate, the big change. You can see how this one goes even further up the Potomac River than the 48th House District, all the way up to Loudoun County. It's still 57% Arlington County. So even though geographically it looks like we have a small portion of this district, population-wise, we still have the majority of the district. 32% in Fairfax County and just 11% in Arlington County. Now, how many people know that there's a primary the 23rd of August? How many didn't know there was a primary? All right, now you do. There's a primary. There's a primary in a couple of districts. We're expecting Democratic primaries in the 30th and 31st Senate District and also the 49th House District. And you probably have seen the candidates that I've displayed on these slides if you're reading the slides. Here's what the 31st Senate District looks like in Arlington County. These precincts, the portion in the upper northwest portion of Arlington County, those 10 precincts are what moved from the 31st District to the 32nd Senate District. Now back in Arlington County, as Delegate Brink says, Senator Howe did represent just 4 precincts in Arlington up until 10 years ago. Then they were moved out of Arlington. Now they're back in Arlington along with several other precincts for a total of 10 with a portion of Ballston precinct. So it's this corner of Arlington County. If you live in one of these precincts, you're the only ones in Arlington County on the 23rd of August who will not have a Senate race on your ballot. You will have Commonwealth's attorney only. We also have a primary for Commonwealth's attorney. Okay, what to expect this year? We will be mailing new voter cards to all voters in Arlington County, not just those affected by redistricting, because only about 40% of our voters have had changes. So as Delegate Brink said, it's been a relatively minor change within Arlington County, but we have decided to mail voter cards to all voters, and they'll be going out probably in late July. Again, not everybody will have General Assembly offices on the ballot. The entire county will have the Commonwealth's attorney ballot, so everybody has a primary ballot, but everybody else except for those in the 32nd district will have General Assembly offices on their ballot. We have 3 precincts that have been split between the districts, different districts. As Delegate Brink says, the General Assembly has to come up with relatively even numbers. There's a very small margin of error there between the various districts, the 80,000 for the House districts, and similarly for the Senate districts. So as a result, sometimes it means that they have to split a precinct in order to make those margins. And that happened in 3 of our Arlington precincts. I believe there were something like 225 or 224 precincts throughout the state that ended up being split as a result. So what we need to try to do, because it is confusing for voters, it's difficult for us to manage these elections, we need to try to somehow resolve those splits. So we're going to do that with some changes prior to the November election, no time to do it before the primary. So those voters, affected voters, will get new voter card later in September. Here's where Ballston precinct is split between the 32nd and the 31st Senate. What we're doing is we're moving the 32nd Senate portion over to the Westover precinct to increase the size of that. We'll also do some shifting of boundaries between Ballston and Buckingham so that they're more even in size. In Jefferson precinct, what we're doing is we're moving the 47th House district portion of Jefferson precinct over to the adjacent Barcroft precinct, which is also in the 47th district, increasing the size of that one, keeping Jefferson a little bit smaller. And then in Oak Ridge precinct, where it's split pretty much in half, and this is a pretty large precinct anyhow, it's one of our largest with over 4,000 voters, we're actually splitting that into 2. The new Oak Ridge precinct will vote at Oak Ridge School, and we'll create a new precinct which we'll call Gunston, voting at Gunston School. Makes a little bit more sense that way. So those are the changes. People who've been to my training classes, my election training classes, know I use a lot of little cutesy animals. Anyhow, so I'll be happy to take any questions for you afterwards. Thank you.
And our final speaker this evening is Dr. Michael McDonald. Dr. McDonald is the Assistant Professor of Government and Politics in the Department of Public and International Affairs at George Mason University. Dr. McDonald was sharing with us that he's been a commentator on MSNBC. He's worked with a firm to do exit polling out of elections and has spent a lot of time in his life writing and learning about how elections really are called and what makes up an election. So he knows the back end very well, but tonight he's going to share with us some of the front end in terms of what are options to redistricting, how do we deal with pulling out that third element that Delegate Brink talked about, partisanship, from our elections, and what can we do to make it better? So Dr. McDonald.
Thank you. My name's Michael. I'm a reforming gerrymanderer. But sometimes I fall off the wagon. I've actually been involved in redistricting as a consultant in 7 states, including California, recently in Virginia, New Jersey, in this round so far, and I expect more to follow. And very importantly, I also served as a consultant to the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission, and I'll talk a little bit about alternative ways of doing redistricting. Here in Virginia, well, in the last election, Governor McDonald made a campaign promise that he would form an independent advisory commission on redistricting. And when it looked as though last year that he was going to renege on that campaign pledge, I was approached by some advocates on the Republican side to hold his feet to the fire. And through a project that I was engaged in called the Public Mapping Project, and through that project we were making software and data available to allow the public to draw redistricting plans to increase the amount of transparency and public participation in the process. Through that project, we conceived of holding a redistricting competition here in Virginia. And you might have heard a little bit about that in the news. We were very successful. We had student teams at 15 student teams located at 12 universities and colleges produced 55 plans. And Delegate Brink was kind enough, I believe you introduced one of the student plans. So the students demonstrated that it is possible for even freshmen in college to draw legal redistricting plans and have them introduced as bills in the legislative process. And that's very important because some of those student plans were actually very innovative about how they approached some of the minority voting rights issues in the state, and came up with a new way of configuring the congressional districts to create an influence district. And if you look at the plan that's being proposed by the Black Caucus in the state legislature, it has many of the elements that William and Mary Law School team came up with in their congressional plan. So not only can these students produce maps, they can actually produce maps that can help illuminate the policy process in the state. So we were very successful with that competition. I felt that we had a lot of students participating. We actually educated not only the students but also the policymakers about what was possible with redistricting, and we also educated the public very much because the media really latched on to this story as they could go to a student and ask them how they were approaching redistricting rather than approaching me and having me give my dry example of, well, this is what redistricting is and this is what happens. Here they could ask students. So it added a human interest element to the story that they'd never had before. And we had over 50 news articles on the competition. Well, along the way, once it became obvious that we were going to have this competition, I think Governor McDonald had a change of heart. And so he saw that there was going to be an outside group creating plans and driving some of the policy debate. So he decided that he was going to create his commission that he, up to that point, had reneged on. And I was asked by the governor's office to serve as a mapping consultant for that advisory commission as well. And that commission drew maps according to 4 principles. Delegate Brink already covered a couple of them: equal population and respect to the Voting Rights Act. But there were 2 additional ones. And one of them actually is a state constitutional requirement, even though Delegate Brink didn't mention it, which is that districts have to be compact. If you look at those districts that you saw on the screen, they don't look very compact to me. The other thing that, the other criteria that Governor McDonald asked the commission to adhere to was to respect existing political boundaries. So the counties and existing independent cities, we would look at those as well. And so the commission did produce maps. And believe me, I've been, again, involved in redistricting since the late 1980s. It was remarkable that we were actually able to produce maps in a very short amount of time. If I was going to be suspicious, I would have thought that that commission was designed to fail. But it actually was very successful as well in producing maps and, again, helping to drive the policy debate in the state. And I think the important thing, if you look at those maps, and they're on the Legislative Services website, so you can go there and take a look at some of those that were introduced as legislative bills as well. What you'll see is, for example, Arlington County could have 1 Senate district. You don't need to split Arlington County into 4 different Senate districts. It has almost the right amount of population to have just 1 Senate district within the county boundaries. And you only really need to cross the county boundary once if you're drawing the House districts. So as you look across the state and you look at respecting existing political boundaries, if you look at the compactness of the districts, it is possible, and we've demonstrated both by the students who are doing this and by the Governor's Commission that we can achieve these goals of respecting the Voting Rights Act, which is one of the things that a lot of voting rights advocates say that we can't do. We actually can do that. We actually can enhance minority representation. We actually increase the number of what we call influence districts, and in one case actually found a way of drawing an additional a majority district for the state house through the Governor's Commission. So we can enhance minority representation. We can draw districts that are more compact, and we can draw districts that respect more existing political boundaries than what was produced by the legislature. All due respect to our members, but they didn't have a lot to say in the process anyway because they were in the minority party. But even on the other end, on the Senate side, in some ways the Senate map does much more violence to compactness and respecting existing political boundaries than the House map does, and that a lot of it has to do with the way in which, if you follow this criteria, they sort of naturally advantage the Republicans in some ways. So the Republicans are very receptive of following those things, and the Democrats, when they had to draw their pro-democratic gerrymander in the state Senate, they broke a few eggs when they were doing that. So what we demonstrated then is that there are alternative ways of approaching this, and there are other states have done this. They've already embraced these reforms. Arizona back in 2000 created through a ballot initiative, the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission. And that commission is also tasked with many of the same things I've talked about: equal population, respecting Voting Rights Act, compactness, respecting existing political boundaries. They also do some additional things. They respect existing communities of interest. They also draw competitive districts, something that only one other state has in terms of their state criteria. And that commission, I worked for it 10 years ago. A lot of litigation involved around it, but the commission's work was successfully defended in the state. And so what that commission also demonstrates is that you can actually do this. You can create these commissions. They can actually produce plans that are put into effect and will stand up the test of time and litigation. Now, is that ever going to happen in Virginia? Probably not. There are only a few states that don't have the initiative process where we've seen real redistricting reform. And Iowa would be one example of that. And the politics there had much to do with a divided state government and a compromise that resulted from this divided state government. So it looked as though we had a potential of doing that in Virginia, actually, because we had, for the first time in the Commonwealth's history, a divided state legislature. So there might have been a way to reach some sort of compromise, but the Republicans in the House were not interested in that, and so those reform efforts fell short. In other states, we have seen significant reform. California this last decade adopted a commission. Florida adopted additional redistricting criteria. And so we're going to have to see how those play out, particularly California, because that's the largest state in the country. That could have a very significant effect in terms of the overall composition of Congress as we see things evolve in that state. In Florida, what's interesting is that even though Republicans control the process, they now have to respect existing political boundaries. And so it may be that that Republican government is going to be constrained a bit from producing the most ideal Republican gerrymander that they might otherwise have in Florida. So we have seen significant reforms: Arizona, California, some other places, Florida. I can name a few other states. Maybe we can at least move the policy debate forward about how to do this better in the future, because we have shown that it is possible. We can have the public engaged. We can draw districts that make more sense to respect existing political boundaries, existing communities as well. And if there was one thing that I really wish would have happened out of this whole debate was that, and in this redistricting, is that I'm disappointed that we got started so late in doing the public education effort. Because once the public became engaged, people started articulating what their communities were and what they thought would be sensible ways of drawing these districts. But it happened all very late in the process, and by the time that the public was engaged, the legislature really didn't have a chance to listen to what they had to say. So I think hopefully moving forward, if we think back 10 years from now, we can put at least a better process of public input into this process, because I do think it's very important for people to define their representation rather than have the politicians do it, because what they do is, as Delegate Brink already mentioned, is they have political goals in mind. They don't really care about the representational needs of their constituents when they're drawing their districts. They're thinking about their own butts, quite frankly, and how they're going to get reelected, and a part of that, how they're going to have majority control of the legislature. So doing it in a different way, I think, would produce a much different outcome. And I'd be welcome to take your comments and questions as well. So should we just move over here?
Thank you. If we could ask our speakers to all move to the podium. While they do, I will remind you that we now have our question and answer portion of the program, which means your questions need to be in the form of a question and not a comment or not political statements this evening. We also ask our speakers to answer the questions as succinctly as possible so we can handle as many questions as possible this evening. I believe John Richardson, our historian, and Doug Scheffler are carrying, one of our program committee members, are carrying the mic this evening. So if you have a question, if you'll raise your hand and be acknowledged, then we can move forward. Doug, go ahead and start with Gail. Please state your name, stand and state your name, and then your question.
Hi, I'm Gail Dennis. Is this thing working?
Yep.
A number of the districts cover, say, 3 or 4 political or city organizations, maybe Loud, maybe Fairfax, Arlington, Alexandra. When the office holder takes a stand that is not what necessarily we want in Arlington, for example, the 66 controversy, what are the constituents that are in Arlington supposed to do to defend themselves against their own representative?
I guess that'd be to me, huh? That's an interesting question, and I've actually been thinking about it quite a bit since I had 30%, 20,000 new people added in McLean. And one thing that I think is very important, and I think that it goes to our role as legislators, is to look for the commonalities, for the things that we share, rather than to be seeking out the things that divide us. In the case of I-66, for instance, one of the things that people said after the map came out that gave me McLean, they said, well, you've been opposed to the widening of I-66. What about all those people up there who want I-66 widened? And what I looked at is there is commonality in the concerns that people in the neighborhoods along 66 have, as well as the people in McLean who are along both the Dulles Access Road and the Beltway, where there's a tremendous amount of construction going on. So one of the things that I'm looking to do, and that I intend to look to do if I'm reelected, is to make sure that in the transportation planning process that there's adequate notice and opportunity for those neighborhoods to be protected. In the case of I-66, as well as up there, this means sound walls, amenities such as the landscaping that was put in, lighting that isn't intrusive back into the neighborhoods, and so on. This is something that is of common interest to the entire new 48th, and that's the way I'm going to proceed.
I'd like to also take a shot at that as well, which is to say that in California, back during the 1990s, there were areas of Los Angeles County that were split among multiple districts, and one of them was Chinatown. And during the riots, it was adversely affected back in 1992. And they were split among 5 different districts. And so when they went to their representatives in the state legislature and asked them to help them out with their needs following the riots to rebuild their community, none of the members there said that they actually represented that community. Mm-hmm. And they had nobody to be their advocate for them in the state legislature. So that's why I feel very strongly that we need a system that's based more on representing the constituents and thinking about how best to align the districts to serve constituent needs.
I have a follow-up question as we're moving to our second question, which is, what's the impact of voting overall when these redistricting plans come into being? I mean, is there any evidence that the changes themselves adversely affect voter turnout?
Actually, there is. What happens is that people are less familiar with their new member that they've been redistricted into. So there's a disconnect in terms of representation there, and it reduces voter turnout in the district. But also, you get a strange perverse effect as well, because many of the members wait, or potential candidates wait until after redistricting. They take the election off before a redistricting because they don't know where the lines are going to be. So many of them wait until afterwards, and then because the incumbents are representing new constituents who are unfamiliar with them, they're temporarily more vulnerable. And so you tend to see more qualified challengers come out after redistricting. So there's a countervailing effect where, yes, people are less familiar with their members, and so they are less likely to vote, but also there's more competitive elections that are happening immediately following redistricting because of the shakeup that's happened.
Is that fair warning?
That is a fair warning, yep. That's what you have to expect.
Okay, a question here.
Thank you. John Weisstadt. Most political observers agree that the Democrats did a masterful job of gerrymandering the state Senate for incumbent protection, and the Republicans did the same thing in the House of Delegates. My question to Delegate Brink and others who may care to answer is, given this fact, and given the fact that when you have one-party control of government, there may not be much likelihood of redistricting reform. Delegate Brink and others, what is your prognosis for redistricting reform in Virginia in the next decade?
There's been an effort, and I've been part of an effort for the better part of the past decade to move redistricting reform to the front with and saying this is going to happen in 2011. Unless we do something now, it's not going to happen. We're going to have the same system, and we're going to have the same system exacerbated by advances in computer technology, which enable you to draw even more finely gerrymandered districts than you could before. And it's been, and we fell short. Over several election cycle, General Assembly cycles, there was redistricting reform passed out of the Senate, and it met death one morning at 7 a.m. On the House side. I think what it's going to take, and what I'm going to talk to some of the nonpartisan people who are concerned about this, what it's going to take is a 10-year effort, and in all likelihood, a constitutional amendment. This means a long-term education process, because the effects of drawing the lines the way they are drawn now, Professor McDonald mentioned several of them, but more than anything else, it leads to this sense of disengagement from your government. If you are a Republican in an overwhelmingly drawn Democratic district, you can very easily come to feel that your vote doesn't count, and the converse happens as well. When you have this kind of disengagement, that's when you lose faith and connection with the government. So it's something that we need to do, but it's going to take a good long time.
In the very back. Our State Board of Election Representative, Dave Foster.
Education.
State Board of Education, sorry.
Education, although that's been known to be linked to elections, hasn't it, Cecilia?
Yes.
Dave Foster, and after thanking our panel for an excellent presentation, let me ask you about the deadlines looming still on these plans. As you know, as you mentioned, Delegate Brink, they have to be approved by the federal government, actually, under the Voting Rights Act. I believe our Attorney General has taken the unique step of sending them to both the Department of Justice and the District Court in Washington. in hopes one or the other will approve them in time. In time meaning August 23rd's primary date, backed up by, is it 45 days for military voters to have their ballots sent out? So you got a few hours left. What are the odds they'll be approved in time to stick to the schedule?
That depends on what view the Justice Department takes of these plans. The assumption sending those plans out of both the House and Senate and signed by the governor was that they fell within the parameters of what would be acceptable to the Justice Department. We shall see whether or not that's the case. Incidentally, one of the idea that sending these plans to the courts as well would somehow expedite them, I don't think would be borne out. Because if you go into a litigative posture where it's the Commonwealth of Virginia versus the United States Department of Justice, what you're going to get is a full-scale lawyer medley, complete with discovery, all of the other things that you get when you go into court. And I think that you'd see approval of these 2011 plans sometime around early 2013, if that's the way it turns out.
Linda, do you have the actual date?
Yes,
know you're
I
working
would
on
just
those.
like to add that from a practical standpoint, the deadline for us to mail absentee ballots for the August 23rd election is the 8th of July. Now that's coming up very, very quickly. The State Board of Elections has told us that their goal is to have, well, it's not really their goal, their hope is to have approval by no later than the 5th of July in order to give us time to make the flip on our election system to change the precincts into the new districts. That's a very, very short time period. The plan right now is for the primary, we will have the ballots certified by, the party chairs will certify the ballots to the State Board of Elections by next Friday. That's their deadline. So we can have ballots produced and all ready to go. However, fortunately, the General Assembly put a little help, gave us a little help when they did change the primary date this last year. If there are any delays, the State Board of Elections Secretary does have the discretion to move those deadlines back a little bit. So the 45 days isn't written in stone for this year's elections. We can make a few adjustments if necessary.
I'm Joan McDermott. Congressional redistricting is also required after the census, and I believe it's tomorrow. The General Assembly is going to be meeting on that. Is it tomorrow? And then I'm wondering what kind of comments we can hear about any changes in the congressional redistricting.
As a matter of fact, when I leave here, it'll kind of be like the end of a wedding. You can go out to the parking lot and wave goodbye to me as I head down to Richmond. We're going into session tomorrow for the next stage of congressional redistricting. Where we are right now is that the House earlier passed a bill which was a consensus bill agreed upon by the 11 incumbents. And as one of the state senators said, well, 11 people like it, what about the other 8 million? This bill passed, went over to the Senate. The Senate is likely to pass a bill that will take the current, is it third? What number is it?
Fourth.
You're thinking of Bobby Scott's
Bobby
district?
Scott, yeah.
That's the third.
Yes,
It's the third
third district, lower the minority percentage there and increase the minority percentage in the current fourth district to make it a minority opportunity district. This is going to be an interesting battle. What's going to happen is that this will come over to the House tomorrow afternoon in all likelihood, and then we'll go into one of our legislative parliamentary things where it will go into the House will disagree with the Senate amendment to the House bill, and it'll go into a conference which will be resolved at the earliest sometime in July. One reason that this will be interesting is there's much more time for the congressional plan to play out. One of the reasons that we're under the gun is that we have, under the Constitution, we have these odd year elections. And so we were the first state to get our information from the Census Bureau on the new census figures. We rushed through the process. It disadvantaged tremendously the project that Professor McDonald described in terms of building up awareness of the possibilities of an alternative to the way things always have been. But that's a matter of the calendar as much as anything else, and I think it's pretty regrettable.
I'm Marjorie Hobart. 10 years ago, when we redistricted, Karen Darner had a district that was entirely in South Arlington, and then had a district that was in Alexandria, Arlington, and Fairfax. And her personal experience was that was a very much more difficult service to perform, especially since we have a citizen legislature in Virginia and everybody has to have a real job to support themselves. So my question to you, Delegate Brink especially, and maybe Patrick wants to say something about this, Patrick Hope, is how does it affect the legislator to have to deal with multiple very active communities or entities, jurisdictions, rather than a single jurisdiction?
Well, Karen Darner was especially disadvantaged. And oh, by the way, she had knee surgery today, and I got an email that's saying she's doing fine. So if you want to send her a card, that'd be a nice thing to do. Karen was especially disadvantaged because she was so terribly darn conscientious. And so she had 3 jurisdictions to represent, and by golly, she would go to everything that any of those 3 jurisdictions put on. Now that 49th district now has been moved, as Linda mentioned, has been moved so that it is entirely Arlington and Fairfax. It's one jurisdiction down. Patrick's district, the 47th, remains entirely within Arlington, and as I mentioned, my district now extends up into Fairfax County. It does impose an additional challenge. There's no question about it. But I think that for instance, the situation that the 48th district is in now, with a large portion of Fairfax County, 7.5 new precincts, and a cohesive community of interest there, is preferable to the one precinct, the one kind of orphan precinct that I represented 10 years ago. It means that I have a good deal more focus with an entire neighborhood, an entire area, rather than just that one little area sitting out there. So there are arguments on both sides. It would be preferable just in terms of the number of meetings that you go to, the number of different groups that you meet with, 3 chambers of commerce if you represent 3 districts, 3 school boards, 3 supervisory boards, and so on. But it does make it more of a challenge, but under the current system, that's something you just have to factor in.
Hi, my name is Peter Fallon. My question is primarily for Ms. Lindberg, but certainly if the others would like to answer as well. Well, we've been talking about redistricting. At the end of the day, it's all about where we go to vote and who we vote for. Your office has certainly been at the forefront in the last number of years with using technology, the electronic voting machines, the electronic poll books, and also expanding the early in-person voting at the courthouse center. Do you see that continuing? Again, there's always claims about the risks of technology and what have you. But if this is really about making voting more inclusive, participative, and convenient for people, so they can participate in democracy at its basic level, what changes do you see with that going forward, or is that under risk now?
Well, at this point in time, we don't intend to make any changes other than what we're already doing in terms of technology, and I don't think redistricting is going to play a large part in that, with the exception being in the 3 precincts that are split between House districts or Senate districts for this particular primary. because we do have the technology available to us with the electronic poll books. If you are in one of those precincts, when you present to vote, we'll be able to tell you which of the ballots you'll receive, whether you'll get the House ballot or not get the House ballot. For example, if you're in Jefferson Precinct, if you get the 49th House District ballot, or you'll get just the 31st Senate and the Commonwealth's Attorney ballot. So that will enable us to send you to the proper voting machine. So that's where, in terms of redistricting, that's where technology is going to assist us. At this point in time, I recently participated in a workshop at the Election Assistance Commission on voting system sustainability, and it was all kind of doom and gloom because nobody really knew where we were going with technology, with voting in the next several years, because things have been moving very, very slowly. It's a very slow process, and we don't have the time to get into that here this evening. We'll probably stick with our current equipment for as long as we can, the existing touchscreen machines, which are very popular in Arlington. In 2008, when we offered an alternative system, a paper-based system, in addition to our touchscreen machines, you all came out to vote and you chose the touchscreens 80% over 20% over the paper ballots. In absentee voting, it was even a shorter margin, a lesser margin. It was 90-10, even though we had 4-hour waits that last day that we had absentee voting in 2008. So that tells us what we believed all along, is that in Arlington County, you like your electronic voting machines, you like your touchscreen voting machines.
My name is Carl Van Newkirk, and we're talking about splitting the precincts between districts, and to me, this seems like a pretty dumb idea. And so I'd like to ask, is this really not as dumb as it sounds because technology can fix it, or is this something that only a politician could love?
This politician will take that. The reason for the split precincts is not totally perversity on the part of the map drawers. One of the requirements under which redistricting went forward was what kind of population, percentage population deviation you could have. The Senate was working under a 2% population deviation. The House, against what I thought was the right way to go, went down to a 1% population deviation. So in order to get anything that tight, that means with an 80,000 person district, you could go up or down only 800 people. In order to get within those tolerances, you had to split precincts. It was the only way to do it. And so that's what happened with both Oak Ridge down in the south, where the electoral board is creating the new Gunston precinct, and with Jefferson in the middle of the county, where in order to bring the adjacent districts into compliance with those population requirements, that's what had to be done to come in on the numbers.
And we're going to see some more splits once we have the congressional districts, because maybe not in Arlington, because the 8th congressional district probably will still contain primarily Arlington, but and those districts have to be of absolute equal population. So you inevitably, zero. If you can divide the state by the number of districts, you got to have zero deviation. So we're likely to see at least some precinct splits around the state as a consequence of the congressional redistricting, which is yet to come forward. But I would say that there are other ways of doing this. Virginia, unfortunately, because of the tight timeline, doesn't have some of the luxury of some of the other states, but other states do try and align their precincts as much as possible with their district boundaries. It's just that, and they may do a re-precincting before they actually do the redistricting. That's what Wisconsin does. So you could do that. You could have an alternative approach. It's just that I think a lot of what happens in Virginia is driven by the very compressed time schedule. It wouldn't be a bad idea, quite frankly, to do redistricting in 2003. There are 2 other states that do that, Montana and Maine.
Thank you very much, and let's give a round of hand to our speakers. As we're closing this evening,